This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today I'm bringing you a bonus video. We've pretty much reached the end of Phyrexia All Will Be One Limited season, as March of the Machine preview season really kicks off tomorrow, and the set review for the new format is only about a week away. As usual, near the end of a format, I like to take a look back at the set review and discuss the cards I got wrong and why, so that's what we'll be doing today with All Will Be One. My set reviews always come out before I actually play a format because the reviews are meant to get you ready for your pre-releases in the early stages of the format, so in this video I'll be taking a look at cards that I got wrong by more than half a letter grade now that I've drafted the format 60 plus times. If you don't know what my grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, let's dive in with a look at the cards I got wrong in Phyrexia All Will Be One. So the first card I want to look at is Skrelv's Hive. I gave this a C+. I liked the idea of the card, coming down and making all of these bodies, but I didn't love how it looked if you were behind, but there's one key thing that I overlooked, and I knew it had this corrupted ability, but I didn't really take into account that there would be decks that are pretty consistent at getting corrupted going relatively early, and because of that, if you play Skrelv's Hive and you're behind, it usually also gives lifelink to most of your creatures in play. If you end up in the most synergistic toxic decks. So it's actually pretty hard for your opponent to beat this in a lot of situations. There are times where it's bad, like you play this and you don't have any other toxic creatures, you're nowhere near corrupted, but those situations don't happen often enough for this to just be a C+. So in the end, I think this was a B. Next up, it is Veil of Assimilation. I gave this a B-. It was significantly worse than this. Most cards in my set reviews that I'm wrong about are because I underrate them. Not true here, I overrated this. I knew the format had a lot of artifacts in it. I was excited because all the mites are artifacts, and I thought that would be enough, especially in the blue-white deck, for Veil of Assimilation to be pretty good, buffing your things and stuff. So I gave it just a flat B-, but that was just wrong. I don't think it's unplayable. I think I'm still higher on this card than most people, but it is a build-around card, and it's not that great of one. It's an F in your typical deck in the format. If you're in blue-white and you have 13 plus artifacts, it comes out as a C. There will be turns where it's absolutely absurd, and those are easy to remember when you think about this because you put into play 2 or 3 artifacts and you make things absolutely insane, but there's also lots of turns where it doesn't do anything, and you really have to think about the situations where it really works out and balance them with the ones where it does nothing. It's really a feast or famine type card, and that's what means that it has a much lower floor than I expected and a lower ceiling. Let's move to blue now, where I've got Quicksilver Fisher. Limited creatures have gotten a lot better these days, and I gave this a C+. I thought it had reasonable enough stats and it wasn't blown away by it, but I thought the stats were good enough and the loot effect on entering the battlefield was enough for this to be a card you'd play in most of your blue decks, but it just didn't pan out that way. Only having 3 toughness was a huge liability. Most of the other really good 5-drops in the format could just mangle this thing. It couldn't block them. Maybe it can attack through them, but you really needed creatures in this format who could block somewhat reasonably, like the turn you play them, have an impact on how your opponent's turn goes, and that just wasn't true of Quicksilver Fisher most of the time. It just had basically too low of toughness for the mana cost for it to be a reliable card. And, it wasn't terrible. You could run it and it wasn't the worst thing ever, but it was more like a C-, a card that usually doesn't make the cut, or at least a card that doesn't make the cut half the time. Next, there's Watchful Blister Zoa, which has a similar problem. I also gave it a C+. It is a 6-mana 4/4 flyer. That's too much mana for this stat line. The red and green decks have access to so many beefy creatures that cost about this much mana that just laugh at Watchful Blister Zoa. And then the decks that aren't doing that sort of thing, most of them have a game plan that involves attacking a lot early and getting you to the point where you're too far behind to win anyway. And something that costs 6 was a real liability in the format in a lot of situations. Again, it's like the Quicksilver Drake, it's okay. It didn't go from a C+ to unplayable, but it was a card you ended up cutting a lot, and it's more like a C-. Next up, it is Axiom Engraver. I gave this a D+, which was too harsh. A 2-mana 1/3 that rummages is something we've seen a lot, creatures with similar stats and abilities, and they just haven't been that good because they don't have that impactful of a body, and the effect's not that great. But something I overlooked here that ended up being a bigger deal than I expected is, first of all, if you're in red, you often want to be playing something early that has oil counters on it because you have all these oil counter payoffs, and it does that. It just comes into play with them, and all the cards that did that were more playable than they would have otherwise been because they set up all of your oil payoffs in the early game. Additionally, not paying any mana at all to Rummage just ended up feeling way better than I ever expected it to. So the ability itself was actually better than I ever thought it would be. And then the oil synergy ended up really mattering. And in the end, it was a solid 2-drop. It was a C. Next, there's Chimney Rabble, which I gave a C to. This one I think I just really underrated. I don't care what format it is, like a 4-mana 3/3 with haste that puts a 1/1 into play is probably going to be better than a C. But in this format, it ended up being surprisingly good, mostly because cards you could play that could play offense and defense at the same time, whether they had vigilance, whether it was like the Mantis that attacked and could untap itself if you removed an oil counter, or whether it was Chimney Rabble. Like, these things all ended up being really good in the format because so many games came down to just racing, not blocking the opponent's stuff that much. But this putting a 3/3 into play that attacks right away and giving you a 1/1 that can block or trade for something ended up being a lot better than I expected. And, the data on the card says it's potentially the best common in the set. And in the end, I do value it pretty highly at about a B-. The only sort of awkward thing about it is it doesn't have any synergy with anything going on in the format, but it turns out this is just powerful, and that's enough of a reason to play it. Next up, there's Gleeful Demolition, which I gave a B- to. So I thought this format had enough artifacts that a 1 red mana destroy target artifact would be worth it. And then it also had this additional upside that I thought would work well in like a sacrifice deck where you could blow up your own artifact and get 3 1/1s. But it just didn't work out that way. For one thing, the format does have a lot of artifacts, but fewer than I was thinking, clearly. This just doesn't always have a target. It's great against blue-white and kind of mediocre against everyone else. Your opponent might have 3 or 4 targets, but if you're blowing up a might, an opposing might with this or something, it's not very good. And you do need that mode to be really good to make this worth it. Even destroying your own might to get 3 1/1s it's fine, but it's not that insane, especially if you're trying to poison your opponent anyway. So this was more of a sideboard card. I think it was a D in your main deck, and it was really good out of the sideboard, like a B-. Like, as far as sideboard cards go, like bringing this in against blue-white could be pretty devastating for them. Paying 1 to destroy their Cephalopod Signpost uncommon felt amazing. Next up, there is Koth, Fire of Resistance, who I only gave a C+ to. Now, this one's kind of funny because he made sure to show up early and often when I was drafting this format. I think I drafted him 5 or 6 times, after I was like, he's a good planeswalker, but he's not amazing. And my reason for this was I thought you'd have to be heavy enough on mountains to really get good use out of him. And that's hard to do in Limited. You're basically never a monocolor deck or even a deck leaning mostly into one color. You're usually looking at a deck where you have like 9 lands of one type and 8 of another. And I just didn't think that would be enough, but I was wrong. Playing Koth on turn 4 and using his +2 puts his loyalty at a high enough place that he's usually not killable right away. And then if he can just, keep drawing you mountains with his +2, eventually you can actually get to the emblem and win the game that way. That was very doable. And a lot of the time, sure, you play him and you only have 3 mountains in play, but that's often enough to kill your opponent's best creature on turn 4. So I do, in the end, I still don't think he's a bomb. Like, he's not really a commander who can pull you ahead from behind. And that's what a bomb would need to do to really get there on bomb status. There are definitely times where you draw him and he just doesn't do enough against what your opponent has going on. But if you're at parity or you're ahead, Koth really seals the deal for you, and he gets about as close to a bomb as you can with a B+. Next up, there's Magmatic Sprinter. I really liked the design on this card. The idea that it says 3 mana 3/2 haste that can put oil counters on things or on itself was something I thought was a really good design, and that would be a useful way to put energy, or not energy, it sort of felt like energy, but put oil counters on your other stuff. And I gave it a B. Like, I thought it would be a really key card for those red-green oil decks, but I was just entirely wrong. The main problem here, and I've already alluded to it, is that this is not something that you play and that stays on the board. And if you're spending mana in this format, you need to be affecting the board in some sort of long-term way. And by, I don't mean like crazy long-term, but I mean a creature who's going to be around for more than a turn, or something that removes an opposing creature. Like those are the things you had to do. And it was very difficult to want to play this thing and, not have something on board. Like you could play it, put the oil counters on it, and then use it to block, but like that's really bad for what you're paying. And if you're trying to do oil counter shenanigans with it, it can be pretty bad too. This is another card where there are some insane turns. Like I think in the early access draft, I did some crazy stuff with Magmatic Sprinter that had me really high on it after the early access format, event rather. So crazy things can happen, but there are lots of situations where it's a huge liability that this can't stick around and block and stuff. So it was more like a D. Next up, it's Urabrask's Forge, another red rare that I underrated. I gave it a C+. So similar to Koth, I didn't love the idea of drawing this when you're behind. And I still don't think it's amazing when you draw it when you're behind, especially if you're significantly behind, because it takes a while to sort of build up and get to the point where it really matters. But if you play this on turn 3, it is very hard for your opponent to win because you just keep creating a bigger and bigger and bigger token every turn. And even if you play it later than that, like in the mid game when there's a board stall or whatever, it'll eventually break that stall for you. It also benefited from Proliferate being in the format, oil counter payoffs being in the format, like ways to put oil counters on the Forge were all pretty sweet. So it ended up being a lot like Koth where, it can be game breaking, but it wasn't quite consistent enough at getting you back into a game from behind that I think it's quite a bomb, but it is a B+, which is significantly better than I expected. All right, next there's Adaptive Spore Singer. This card's interesting. Like every time I look at this card, I'm like, why didn't this work out? Because a 3-mana 2/2 with Vigilance that gives +2/+2 and Vigilance to something until end of turn, like that seems fine. You think that would sort of work out. And then you have this Proliferate option. Overall, Proliferate ended up underperforming in the format, I would say. So that option ended up being weaker than I expected. But it even turned out playing a creature that's this inefficient is a huge liability. Like there's so many good combat tricks in the format, so many hyper efficient 1 and 2 drops in the format that the Spore Singer just being a 3-mana 2/2 just wasn't enough. The Enter the Battlefield ability would sometimes allow you to do something, but there were also a lot of situations where it didn't. There are a lot of boards where you can't really attack with your thing because your opponent can still trade for it or block it effectively. And so in the end, the Enter the Battlefield abilities on this card both ended up not mattering as much as I expected. I gave this thing a C+ because I thought both modes would be better than they were. In the end, it was a D+, meaning this is a card you cut more often than you play. Next, there's Expand the Sphere. So, I thought this was a cool ramp spell, especially because it was modal. You could decide to proliferate instead, but there are a number of things wrong with this. I gave it a C. I didn't think it was going to be amazing, but there are a number of things wrong here. First of all, you pay 4 and you usually don't add to the board at all. Even if you're proliferating, most of the time that doesn't add that meaningfully to your board, especially in a green deck. Like blue and red have these cards that get bigger the more oil counters that are on them. And, maybe you have one of those or whatever if you're in red-green or something. But you don't end up with that many of them. So the Proliferate trigger doesn't really impact the board that much. And so paying 4 for a sorcery that doesn't do anything was a good way to lose when your opponent just curved out with like Crawling Chorus on turn 1, the 2/2 First Strike Toxic 1 on turn 2, and then Stinging Hive Master on turn 3. Then if you're doing this on turn 4, well, you've probably lost the game. So in the end, this was just unplayable. I think it's an F. Next up, there's Plague Nurse. This was maybe the biggest underperformer in the format. I mean, not in the sense that I thought it was amazing. I only gave it a C, but I'm still sort of surprised by how bad this ended up being. So the main problem, the main reason this is bad can be summed up with one card, and that is Hex Gold Slash. So if you had any of these 4 toughness toxic creatures, they took a big hit because they could die to a 1-mana removal spell. And you're probably saying, well, not everybody has it. And it's like, okay, that's true. But if you're playing a draft against people on Arena or in person, you're going to run into 2 or 3 people that have Hex Gold Slash, at least one. And that is very bad news for this card. Additionally, the ability, which I didn't think was amazing to begin with, but you find yourself basically never able to activate this because you have to keep adding to the board. If you are at the point where you can activate it, you're probably losing because you don't have anything else to do. So in the end, I think it was a D. It's not quite an F, but this ended up not making the cut pretty often. Next, there's Rustvine Cultivator, which I gave a D. So with this card, I thought it would take too long to ramp you to really be worth it. Unfairly, I sort of compared it to cards like Llanowar Elves and stuff that can give you the mana right away. I didn't love the idea that you had to wait, because basically you play this, it doesn't do anything. Then on turn 2, you can put an oil counter on it. And then on turn 3, you can use it to ramp your mana. And I thought that just wasn't good enough, but I was very wrong. First of all, this could allow you to ramp into like a turn 3 Mantis, which was always amazing. You could ramp into a lot of other stuff with them as well. Second of all, it's another early card that can just get oil counters on it, which I've already said, that was better than I expected because of the oil counter payoffs. But it also turned out the ramp this offered, like you play this in green decks that don't even care about oil counters in the format, because the ramp it offers is actually pretty good. On top of that, being a 1-mana 1/2 was extra good in a format that had a lot of good 1-mana 1/1s. So not only did this ramp better than I expected, but also it ended up being a better stat line than I expected. In the end, it was about a C+. Next, there's Mere Custodian. So I gave this a C. I thought that you would be able to play this like in a deck that really needed artifacts like blue-white, because, letting your opponent scry 1's not awesome, but I thought the fact that it had the artifact type and let you scry 2 was enough to overcome that, but it just wasn't. For one thing, you weren't usually hurting that much. Like if the blue-white deck is open, you end up with plenty of artifacts without trying. You don't really have to run something really subpar like this. And second of all, letting your opponent scry 1 is pretty bad. I mean, I had plenty of times where my opponent played this against me and I got to scry something to the bottom and draw something much better. And that's a big deal. You do get to scry 2, but your opponent takes advantage of whatever card selection they got before you ever do. And that made it more like a D. Next, there's Staff of Completion, which I gave a D+. This was even worse than that in the end. I think the design's really cool, and I think that swayed me. Like, I liked the idea of paying life and all this sort of stuff, and some of the effects are pretty good. But paying this much life, like first of all, proliferating was worse than I expected. So paying 3 life to proliferate in this limited format was worse than I ever thought it would be. And I already didn't like the pay 1 life or pay 2 life abilities that much. I mean, the pay 1 life one is almost useless and limited. And the pay 2 life one, ramps your mana and fixes your mana, but it's really clunky at doing it. So most of what I thought would make this card better than unplayable was proliferate and draw a card. But Proliferate ended up not being very good, and draw a card, paying for life for that is rough. If this format had like a legit life gain deck in it that could counteract, the downside of paying life to draw cards, it would be good, because you don't have to pay any mana. Like that's the big upside here. You don't pay mana to draw cards with this, and that is really good. But when you only have so much life and in a format that is this aggressive, you just couldn't do it. So in the end, it was just completely unplayable. That's all for this video, but I hope you're ready for another full set limited review, because for March of the Machine, it'll be starting on April 5th. There will, of course, be lots of other content for this new set, so if you're not already subscribed, consider subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it. And if you want to catch up on other limited content on the channel, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.